Welcome to Devotionary, where we make the Bible accessible and applicable. Have you ever experienced dark days? Of course you have. We all have. Even as followers of Christ, we can find ourselves walking through what David once described as the valley of the shadow of death. Faith in Christ is not some kind of spiritual force field that protects us from days filled with difficulty or moments that bring despair. One of the things about faith is that it's based on what is unseen. The author of Hebrews put it this way: "Now faith is being sure of what we hope for, being convinced of what we do not see." Hebrews 11, verse 1. And in 1 Samuel chapter 22, verses 14 through 23, we're going to see David having to place his hope in God when everything around him seemed to be spiraling into a black hole of doubt and despair. His actions had resulted in the slaughter of the priests of God, their families, and all the citizens of Nob. And he felt responsible, even though the genocide was the work of Doeg the Edomite, under the orders of King Saul. David couldn't believe what he had heard. He was shocked at the ungodly actions of the man who was supposed to be the shepherd of Israel. But through it all, David was learning some costly yet invaluable lessons about trusting God. The moral, spiritual, and mental state of King Saul was on a steep and rapid decline. His animosity toward David was insatiable, and he wouldn't let anyone or anything stand in the way of his quest to eliminate David once and for all. So while his treatment of Ahimelech and the priests of Nob may shock us, it should not surprise us. Even the priests of God were fair game and subject to Saul's wrath. But while Saul seemed to have lost all fear of and respect for God, his troops had not. He was unable to recruit any of them to carry out his vindictive order to kill the priests. But there was one man who was more than willing, most likely driven by a desire to see himself promoted and rewarded for his efforts. Doeg the Edomite, the man who had been at Nob when David showed up, had made a beeline to King Saul with the news. This Edomite, a foreigner, was more than willing to carry out Saul's command. Doeg was the chief of Saul's herdsmen, and like any other ambitious individual, was probably seeking a way to get out of the pasture and climb the palace social ladder. By carrying out Saul's command when no one else would, he knew he could ingratiate himself to the king and secure his favor. So Doeg slaughtered 85 priests of God that day, and then he killed every living inhabitant of Nob. It was a bloodbath, a senseless, sinful, and Satan-inspired act that would turn the priesthood from Saul to David. A solitary priest, Abiathar, miraculously escaped the carnage that day and made his way to David with the news of what had happened. David was racked with horror and guilt. He felt responsible for the deaths of Ahimelech and his fellow priests. It was his deception that had led to their destruction. He had lied to Ahimelech that day by telling him he was on a secret mission for Saul. His rash decision to seek refuge from the priests and then lie to secure their help had put them at great risk. And Saul, in his ever-present paranoid state, saw them as traitors and had them summarily executed. David most likely assumed that Saul, as the king and a servant of Yahweh, would show the priests the respect they were due. He probably never imagined that Saul would dare lift his hand against the priests of God. But he had been proven wrong, and David was furious. His respect for Saul all but disappeared that day. We get a good idea of David's mental state at the time because he wrote a psalm to commemorate the event. In it he reveals his feelings about Saul. "Why do you boast about your crimes, great warrior? Don't you realize God's justice continues forever? All day long you plot destruction. Your tongue cuts like a sharp razor. You're an expert at telling lies. You love evil more than good, and lies more than truth." Psalm 52, verses 1 through 3. David was a warrior himself, but he was appalled at the actions of Saul. He was shocked at such behavior from someone he once admired and idolized. He couldn't believe that Saul, the king of Israel, could do the things he had done, but he knew that God would not let Saul's actions go unpunished. "You love to destroy others with your words, you liar, but God will strike you down once and for all. He will pull you from your home and uproot you from the land of the living." Psalm 53, verses 4 through 6. David was confident that God would bring justice and retribution against Saul. He would not allow this immoral act to go unaccounted for. While David was in no position to do anything about it, he knew that God would. The righteous will see it and be amazed. They will laugh and say, "Look what happens to mighty warriors who do not trust in God." They trust their wealth instead and grow more and more bold in their wickedness. Psalm 53, verses 6 through 7. Through the misguided and unrighteous actions of Saul, David was learning some valuable lessons regarding those who failed to place their trust in God. He saw in King Saul a stark portrayal of the formerly godly man who abandons his faith in God for a reliance upon his own strength and resources. Saul's blatant betrayal of God was difficult for David to understand, but it drove him in his commitment to place his trust in and maintain his reliance upon God, no matter what happened. But I am like an olive tree, thriving in the house of God. I will always trust in God's unfailing love. I will praise you forever, O God, for what you have done. I will trust in your good name in the presence of your faithful people. Psalm 53, verses 8 through 9. Abiathar, the sole remaining priest, would find refuge with David. The future king of Israel and the future high priest of Israel were suddenly united by one man's hatred of them and God's divine plan for them. Neither David or Abiathar knew what God had in store. David had no idea what the next years of his life would hold. Abiathar only knew that he was alone and no longer able to exercise his priestly duties. Both men were unaware of all that God was doing behind the scenes. There was no silver lining to the dark cloud that hung over them. There was no light at the end of the foreboding tunnel in which they found themselves. But they would learn to trust in God by having to place all their hope in God.